Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. I'm actually going to pre-share the screen here so that we have something to look at. We're going to talk about this article in just a bit, but first, everybody, I'm going to turn Spotlight off so that we can spotlight myself. Unfortunately, I am alone for the day. We'll find out if the one and only Mike Christensen makes his way in, but I know Malo will not be here, nor will Tracy. So it may just be me with you, chat. And yeah, the last 24 hours have been kind of very busy for me. So, um, what is up with those slackers? I know. I agree. I tell them I'll let you out of your dungeon once every 2 weeks. All you have to do is come out and speak about things and listen to me rant for a while. And that some of them don't even take me up on it. Like they're still down in the dungeon. Why are they in the dungeon? I don't know. I can't explain it. It's tough for me to explain. Like maybe I've made the dungeon too nice. I need to take some amenities away from the dungeon, and then people will stop coming to the dungeon, and then they'll come up and be on Shop Talk again. Vote them off the island. Well, then I'd have to find more people to put on the island because although I can probably do this by myself, I like having, I was going to say accomplices, but really it's more like victims. This is sounding more and more. Welcome, everybody, to Shop Talk, the Jeffrey Dahmer stream. So, in case you are new here, we normally don't sound like serial killers. I mean, Anders does, but that's just normal. Um, what we normally do is we say, hey, it's Monday early evening, especially now that daylight savings time has ended. That may be part of my grouchiness is daylight savings time because I rant about daylight savings time twice a year. And I don't think I got a good rant in yesterday on daylight savings time. So I'm not going to take that out on you fine people unless you goad me too hard. But please don't try to goad me too hard on daylight savings time rants. We could probably go back in Shop Talk history and find several of those over the years. But Shop Talk is ideally Monday afternoon, or late afternoon, early evening, depending on your time frame. And we are kicking our feet up after work for some people, in the middle of work for some people, unfortunately. And we'll talk about some technical topics. I actually have one on the screen right now, as you can see, but we'll talk about it in a moment. Time to go to star dates. It even sorts right. I don't know. I don't know about that. Um, I'd have to listen to the debates. Who would antagonize you with masterful derails? That's true, Anders. You would have to get a word in, which I believe in you. I have full faith that you would be able to sneak words in on screen in video, but you do. It's much easier to just slide into the chat and knock everything off the rails, as one does. Because honestly, why does Shop Talk even have rails? Why do we have rails to begin with if we're just going to go off of them? Those are deep philosophical questions that we're not going to answer tonight. Instead, we're going to answer some technical discussion bits. It is a lot easier to get text in. Yes, yes. When I get into presentation rant mode, I stop breathing, and that's pretty cool until I turn different colors. Speaking of different colors, you may note I actually have now. I took down the drop cloth style of green screen, and I now have green paint on the wall. That shows how serious I am. I am now very serious about presentations here. Before, it was like, I could just take off the push pins and pull down the green screen and then vamoose. But now I have this color right behind me. There's no vamoosing with this color. I actually went to the home improvement store on a Sunday. No, excuse me, Saturday. Went to the home improvement store on Saturday. I was looking like, what is the ugliest green that I can find? Because with chroma keys, in case you're not too familiar with this is actually pretty close to chroma key green. It's not exactly on what the ideal chroma key green is, but it's pretty close. It is called Martian if you're ever at Lowe's and get the Valspar paint. Valspar is like not a very high tier in terms of paint quality, but in terms of green screen quality for paint, it works pretty well. Just get flat paint, so you don't want any kind of shine, any kind of sheen on here, and it'll work okay. I've done some tests. It is actually higher quality than the green screen cloth that I had, because it tends, it's not exactly quite uniform, but from this distance with the 50 millimeter lens that I have, there's enough blur in the background that any slight imperfections, you're never going to catch them. So it works out really well. And it's also, I mean, it's not literally permanent. Obviously, I could repaint the wall, but it is there as, hey, I'm here for good. Veldspar, that's a common ore in EVE Online. Close, close. Veldspar, I mean, Valspar is probably a common paint company, but they're not very good. I don't know if Veldspar is any good. Um, I don't want to. I don't want to lay too much smack talk on Valspar because it's basically, it is consumer grade. I want to paint a wall, but I don't want to be good at it type of paint. It's like the I have to do this. My wife is yelling at me, and I have to do this, but I don't really want to do this kind of paint. Uh, so yeah, if I was looking at quality paint, yeah, I'd be spending a lot more money. But actually, I actually looked at the Sherwin-Williams paints. Welcome to Shop Talk, where we're just going to talk about home improvement stores and painting ugly greens. But the Sherwin-Williams greens were too normal. I couldn't pick any of them because, in case you're familiar, like why do we have this ugly color back here? What is the point of that? The reason is Copilot will come up with a derail. Copilot might be able to derail me. That's quite possible. Mostly because I'd be yelling at how dumb Copilot is. But why we pick this particular type of color is that it is almost the opposite of human skin tone. So humans tend to be, we have a lot of reds, we have a lot of pinks, and as a result, if you were trying to filter out, use a chroma key on red, it would look really weird. It would not look good at all. So instead, we put it on almost the opposite of what a human will experience, and that way, people end up coming in really well. And now the downside is, if you're using a chroma key on that kind of green, it's going to limit the clothing, the apparel that you can wear. Like this shirt that I'm wearing, actually, I might have a problem with it because of certain parts. Actually, it's a little bit below where I'm standing, so all the green is down here, but you can probably see a little bit of it there as I leaned back. So those end up not working out very well. But even a darker green, now that I've got this color, I've noticed my darker green shirts just kind of show up as gray, and I'm okay with that. It'll make people think that I have basically two colors of clothing that I wear, when really I have three colors of clothing that I wear. So it's a little bit extra sneakiness there. All right. But that wasn't really what I was here to talk about. I guess I wasn't here to talk about much in particular, so I guess I was kind of in a way here to talk about that because it did burn several minutes, and it's a little bit of behind the scenes of if you're ever interested in color schemes. Like, you will see in film, you will often see blue as the green screen, so it's actually more of a blue, and it's a particular hue. It's more like a cyan. And there are historical reasons for that. My understanding is it has to do with the film that people would shoot on, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. And before I get rambling about old school makeup routines in silent film era, which I actually saw a video on it, it was pretty cool. But before I get rambling on it, let's talk about an actual topic. I am going to spotlight this because this is our first article of the night that we are going to cover. And I'm going to paste the link right here in chat. This comes from Mark Wilkinson, who dropped this in a Slack channel to which I belong. Mala poked at it and said, hey, we should talk about this on stream. And then also said, by the way, you should talk about it because I'm not going to be on stream. So we'll bring that up to her next time. This was actually kind of an interesting article because it has to do with a migration from AWS to running more in a single data center. And some of the costs, some of the benefits, trying to put closer to dollar amounts and time amounts, time and effort on the operation of running in a cloud versus running on premises. And they had an article of a couple of years ago that talked about how they moved from AWS for a lot of their EC2 instances, for some of their software platform as a service offering stuff, and just brought it back down to on-premises solutions. And there were some good questions that this follow-up really covers. A lot of what they're doing is Kubernetes. So in many cases, that the migration from AWS to on-premises is not that difficult. It's, well, you have a Kubernetes cluster, you have nodes, you can deploy containers out to those nodes. A lot of the configuration is going to be pretty similar between EKS and Kubernetes running on premises. So there are some additional things that you have to do. You do have to track logging. You do have to manage a little bit more in terms of network infrastructure, but it's not radically different. It's not a huge decrease in time to be in AWS running Elastic Kubernetes service versus on premises running Kubernetes. And there were some questions around things like failover, because in the original article, they had a single rack. And when you're on a single rack, there is a single point of failure. And that is a realistic concern for a company, that if your data center burns down, which it has happened, it happened recently, happened in France pretty recently. And I have mentioned France because their primary data center is in Paris. So that wasn't the one that burned down, but there are failures that happen. So, okay, second rack in Frankfurt in Germany, which is far enough away that, it's probably fine. It's probably far enough that any localized catastrophe is not going to cause a problem. You'd have to have a fairly major catastrophe to knock out both systems that far away from each other. So pretty decent. One of the things I want to highlight here is local NVMe and eliminating noisy neighbors. This is an area where you can pay enough money to AWS or Azure and get fast enough storage, but it is hard and expensive, especially compared to buying it on your own. This is one of the areas where you can easily get burned in terms of performance, where you can have something that does not perform nearly as well in a cloud versus on premises because your storage subsystem is weak. And where you've got 100 millisecond latency, which is, if you're thinking about a database, that's just awful. Ideally, you want a millisecond. Ideally, you want microseconds if your company is willing to pay for that. A lot of companies aren't willing to pay for that. So if you get 5-10 milliseconds, that's fine. Local NVMe is going to push you down really low in terms of amount of time that you're spending waiting for your storage system to respond. So that will help significantly on database performance, just that alone. In this case, I don't know how much database work that they were doing. I don't know, what kind of performance profiles they had, but they did cut latency nearly 20% by doing this without really changing the application at all. So, that's saying, yeah, you're just making storage faster and probably also cheaper as a result. Now, what they did with the money, let's not go there. That was their call. Whatever. But there were a few questions. This is basically a frequently asked questions response, and I thought it was really interesting when I read it. Looking at things like, well, $230,000 a year isn't very much, and even in the U.S., he's saying in the U.S., that's one engineer's salary. Yeah, that's an engineer's salary in San Francisco, in Seattle, in New York, maybe. It's still more than the burden rate of most engineers in most parts of the country. It's not exactly 2. It's more like 1.5 good engineers. I think, yeah, 1.5 is probably about the right number. If you're considering all of the factors that go into pay, not just the literal salary, but also all benefits, the monetary cost of them, I would roughly estimate about $150,000 a year for an average engineer. And so, yeah, about one and a half. But in Europe, he's saying that's 2 to 5 engineers, and probably closer to 2 in France, closer to 5 as you get further east. I hate the use of the term exponentially here because this is not how exponential curves work. But they are saying, hey, we're now saving over $1 million a year, and so this is pretty decent. It's a pretty decent chunk of change that they're able to save, which is neat. And then they looked like, okay, well, why not buy reserved instances? Reserved instances are great if you have nearly 100% utilization for a multi-year period. If you have very limited utilization, you could look at spot instances, spot pricing. Unfortunately, spot pricing is no longer as fantastic of a deal as it was, say, like 10, 15 years ago. But you can still get some good deals, good discounts on spot pricing if you have very ephemeral workloads that you can just stop them and start them up at arbitrary times and pick back up where you left off. So, research projects or things where it's really asynchronous in nature, meaning not what your average business is doing. Most businesses not going to benefit very much from spot instances. People who are learning, that's a perfect case. I remember that Databricks, for the longest time, their free tier would literally use AWS spot instances, and you would get an error message if there weren't enough spot instances available. Basically, just say, hey, we're only willing to pay 10 cents an hour or 12 cents an hour, whatever number it was. So the spot rate is currently above that. Wait a little bit and try again later, and we'll get you your free instance later, which I think is perfectly fair for a free service. And for that kind of scenario, cool, that makes a lot of sense. For most other scenarios, you can't really run a business on spot instances very effectively. They also talked about some of the other costs that they were dealing with. And what was interesting was the more detailed explanation of what does it look like in terms of people on premises dealing with hardware versus people dealing with cloud infrastructure. You still have those people. You are still dealing with problems. It's just that the nature of the problem has changed a little bit. And one of the things that they talk about is that they would spend a certain amount of time every month trying to cut AWS costs, trying to review the bill, make sure that all of the spending is appropriate, make sure that we're automatically shutting down services, we're automatically stopping things when they don't need to run so that we can minimize this bill. And that makes sense when you're in a cloud environment, but that is a cost. And so that is some number of engineering hours per time period that you do have to factor in. When you go back to on-premises, you don't have that cost. Now, you have other costs. You have costs of dealing with hardware problems, troubleshooting hardware problems, troubleshooting additional networking problems. You'll have some AWS networking problems, but in a lot of cases, you don't tend to have to worry so much about switching and routing. So in many cases, it wasn't so much that they were spending more time or less time on administrative tasks. It was that they spent time on different administrative tasks. And I liked this comment about hardware lifecycle and CapEx. Capital expenditures has gotten such a bad rap in the technical world, and companies tend to flutter between we want CapEx and we don't want CapEx. Some of it depends on the financial situation of the company. Some of it depends on the likelihood that people high up in the company have MBAs. And I think those are a couple of the factors where CapEx for a while had a very negative connotation in the technical world. We want to avoid CapEx because there are a lot of controls. There's a lot of discussion you have to have with accounting. You need to get C-level approval. You need to get all kinds of things in place to be able to spend this money on hardware, for example. And you can only buy hardware once every few years. So you had to scale, you had to have your expectations of where you're going to be in 5 years, because that's the hardware you're going to get now. And as a result, that can be a challenge. Having to effectively predict results, having to effectively predict growth, and if you guess wrong, having to go back to the board and ask for more money is a real challenge. So this is where the siren song of operating expenditures came in of, hey, you just have to spend this thing up. You have a credit card. Cool, use that. And the company can pay it off. It's operating expenditures. And for small amounts, that works out well. But then when your bill is $1 million a month, one of the problems of operating expenditures is that you can't amortize operating expenditures. So if you have an expensive bill, for tax purposes, there's no ability to shuffle that money around over multiple fiscal years. Whereas with capital expenditures, you actually get that benefit. You can write off a certain amount each year and amortize the cost of your hardware, for example, over that 5-year span, which is why companies want a 5-year retention period for hardware so that they can write it off over 5 consecutive tax years. And that smooths out the total tax bill. Whereas if everything is operating expenditures and your operating expenditures are lumpy, you are not necessarily going to be able to get that smooth over the course of multiple fiscal years. So that makes the accountants a bit upset. That makes the financial people upset because you have less control over how much money you have to pay in taxes as a company. And also, there's a risk that, we need to find more money to pay this tax bill because it was unexpectedly high because operating expenditures were so high. So that has been one of the pain points. Also, there's the fact that operating expenditures do not get removed from EBITDA. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's what it is. So basically, EBITDA is the measure that companies use when they are not profitable. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but it is actually really common at startups and other companies where your profit is negative, because EBITDA is essentially saying, well, here's my revenue. And, if you include all of the expenses, yeah, we're losing money. But if you remove these expenses, then look at how much more money we have. So it's kind of like saying, yeah, I know that I'm horribly in debt, but if you look at how much money I make per year, and you remove how much money I'm paying on my house, my car, my stereo system, whatever, pick big expenses, my graphics card that I'm doing rent to own on. If you remove those expenses, I'm looking pretty good. And that's roughly what EBITDA is doing. Speaking of EBITDA, we have the one and only Mike Christensen.
Earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation.
Absolutely, and amortization.
Amortization.
Yeah. See, look at that. Look at that. Mike is on the ball tonight. He comes in 20 minutes in. It's like we're talking about EBITDA, and boom, already know what that is. I got that good. We're talking about an article about a migration from AWS to on-premises and some of the challenges, some of the benefits, and a little bit of discussion here about capital expenditures. And I was mentioning that with capital expenditures, they get taken out of EBITDA. So for your companies that don't turn a profit, capital expenditures are actually better for them than operating expenditures because they let you fluff that number on EBITDA, where, look at how much more money we have because we're not including my house payment.
Right.
So I think overall, really good scenarios here. Great discussion. There's some notions that they pointed out, like this is not necessarily saying do not use a cloud. Actually, one of the things that they do use clouds for here is bandwidth and denial of service. using services like Cloudflare. You can use AWS for certain services. They use it for ice or for Glacier for long-term storage. You might find, hey, Azure using Event Hubs or using some other services, function apps or something that may be beneficial to you because it's more expensive or it's harder to get running on premises. And so as a result, it's fair just to say on-prem and Azure and AWS and Google and whoever else, they were all viable options. So Andrew's saying, so guessing they were early AWS adopters and probably got roped into the save money trope. Quite possibly. Or they were a startup and said, well, we don't want to spend the time and effort having our own hardware, so we'll just use a cloud. And I think that's a perfectly fine reason for using a cloud is, yeah, I'm just trying to start up. I don't have much money. I don't want to spend a bunch of cash on getting good hardware. I don't know much about networking and don't want to hire somebody to do all of the networking. I'd rather just get this set up in a place where it's a lot cheaper to get started. And then as things grow, then you start having to make certain decisions around, do I keep it there? Do I migrate off? And in their case, I mean, they were already using Kubernetes for all of this stuff. So it's not like they were using AWS platform as a service offerings very heavily, which uh, that would make it more of a challenge. Startup, cyclical nature of business, or flexibility in general, not cost. Absolutely. Yeah, don't go to a cloud because of cost. The salespeople will definitely try to sell you on, oh, it's so much cheaper in Cloud X. It's not cheaper in Cloud X. They will give you the reports that make it sound like, look at how much cheaper it is. Because, well, you have to pay for power and you have to pay for all of this other stuff. And I mean, admittedly, I've never footed the bill for data centers, and I know that, yeah, you probably do have to pay some for power, but I'm not powering an entire data center. I'm powering a rack, so I'm not really spending a whole lot of money on hardware and power for that hardware. And some of those numbers, I think, get a little bit fudged to make the story sound better for Azure or for AWS. I just say Azure because I've heard some of those cases a little bit more. We need 4 more 32 core servers by the end of the week. Would have been a nightmare on prem. Exactly. That is a perfectly valid use case to say, hey, this can be in a cloud. I was going to say should be in a cloud, but can be in a cloud. And that being in a cloud can be very useful, and even could be a hybrid where some of your stuff is on premises, some of it is in a cloud. I need more. I need more compute right now. Okay, spin it up in the cloud. If you have a direct connect or express route between your whatever data center you're in and your cloud provider, then you're going to have pretty low latency. So it won't be exactly the same thing as it's on the same rack, but it'll be much better than you're crossing the common internet. And so you can take advantage of that flexibility, knowing that it comes with a price tag associated with it. And as you need it, all right, let's bring that on prem if it makes more sense there. So they also talked about some other things. The audits and compliance, actually, it was funny that this was actually a topic of discussion, because I'm just thinking, yeah, if unless you're running the data center yourself, there's not much more that you have to do for auditing and for compliance. Um, you can talk about specific applications, and they actually do talk a bit about that, of physical controls, of business continuity, and some of the paperwork, some of the additional forms that they have to fill out. But uh, I don't think that it's going to be a radical difference. And audit sucks. Doesn't matter where your servers are. Yeah, exactly. It's going to depend on who your auditor is more than anything else. How well does your auditor understand the situation, and how well do you want to have your auditor understand the situation? If your auditor is looking to check a box and you're looking for an auditor who checks a box, doesn't matter where your servers are. If you have an auditor who really knows their stuff, doesn't matter where your servers are. You're getting out the latex gloves or nitrile gloves, depending on whether you have a latex allergy. All right. And so this was the question about, do you still use the cloud for anything substantial? And yeah, absolutely. I think it is perfectly reasonable to have a multi-tiered strategy. There are other specific use cases where cloud simply will not work. I asked if I could audit the auditors since they seem to have lost an unencrypted backup. Oof. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think that you should have a checklist for the auditors. That seems perfectly reasonable to me.
I like otters. They're very cute when they hold their hands.
uh, all right. So that was, I think, a pretty fun article. There was a lot of detail in here. There were some interesting discussion points, and I wonder if we're going to find more of this kind of article over time as people get away from the cloud or become less cloud dependent. I do think that Kubernetes does help with this a lot because if you are running Kubernetes as your orchestration layer, who cares where the hardware is, honestly? So at that point, your applications don't care if it's in Azure, if it's in AWS, if it's in GCP, if it's on prem. It doesn't matter. The question then becomes, what is the best option given the cost, given the performance, given the opportunity cost, given the expectations of future developments? And so that's a little bit more. It's a little bit more of a challenge than just saying, go to Cloud X. Cloud X is perfect. Everything will work in Cloud X. But we kind of get paid for doing harder things, says the guy who's been dealing with merge replication for literally a day. As with anything, there is one answer. It depends. Well spoken. Spoken like a true consultant, Anders. Next article. Speaking of consultants, next article, I'm going to drop the link in chat here. This is from Greg Lowe. And I thought it was kind of interesting. This actually comes from Brent Ozar's newsletter. And Brent Ozar's newsletter reminded me that Greg Lowe has a blog and that Greg Lowe now has an RSS feed that works, which is good because now I'm following Greg's blog again. It's been a while. It had been a few years and I dropped off my radar. But basically, the question is, why does Greg violate Betteridge's law of headlines? That's the real question in here. So he asks, should SQL Server automatically index foreign key constraints? And I'd say he half violates Betteridge's law of headlines. But going back to Anders and the answer there, the answer is it depends. So Greg does talk about what would be the benefit. Why would you want to have indexes on the key columns of primary key constraints? And as I scroll down through here, we have this primary key that references sales.customers on customer ID. So right over here. In a lot of cases, especially if you're trying to delete a row from sales.customers and you need to delete all of the orders associated. So if you have any sort of cascading delete, you absolutely want an index on here. Otherwise, you're scanning the orders table unnecessarily. If you're looking for orders on a given customer ID, so I may join to sales.customers where customer ID equals Mike Christensen, the one and only. I think there's a comma in there somewhere. But if you now want to find all of the orders associated with Mike, then yeah, we definitely want to have some kind of index leading off of customer ID. And in other cases, though, we might not need the index because the foreign key constraint is really not there for us to drive into, but rather for us to drive out from. So, for example, if we always start from the orders table because I need to find orders where status is not shipped, and I just want to know the customers associated with those orders, having an index on customer ID does not help at that point. I need an index on order status, or maybe a filtered index on order status, and maybe some other filters in there like date, order date range. So those situations would not benefit from an index on customer ID. But if I'm driving into the table through the foreign key constraint, yes, an index absolutely makes sense. For that reason, it's not 100% always create the index. Also, I don't necessarily want an index on customer ID. Maybe I want an index on customer ID, comma, order date, because I always do date range operations. So in that situation, hey, I don't want the index just on this one column. I'm going to have a multi-column index, and I might have an include clause that includes the shipping cost. Well, in that case, I've basically covered the entire table, but let's ignore that. Let's pretend that there are some other columns that are not relevant. But in that scenario, I don't want SQL Server to create an index automatically on customer ID because I know there's going to be a better index, which ties in with what Anders dropped in chat here of we need an install option for SQL Server. Easy mode, I know crap about SQL optimization, and I take full command of the server mode and back off. So yeah, that would be interesting. The I know what I'm doing button, and I kind of wish we had that with technical support as well. The yes, I really have tried this stuff honest button, except let's be honest. How many cases, how many times would we call in and say, no, I know what I'm doing. I am an engineer. And then it turns out that no, you didn't know what you were doing. You didn't even read the first page of the manual. And the thing that you were doing wrong is so blatantly obvious, but a level 1 engineer, a level 1 tech support person would have solved the problem, except that you didn't want to listen. You wanted to go straight to that level 3. That does happen with surprising frequency. But yes, all that said, that might be interesting to have the I know what I'm doing here button, depending on what that does. So in Greg's article, if we, in many cases, we do want to use that foreign key as a filter. And actually, he does explain, well, here's why you might not want to. Number one, you may not go in that direction. Like I mentioned, if you're going down into the table, yes, you definitely want a foreign key constraint that has an index on the other side. So your down table, your bigger table, has the index on that foreign key constraint column. That's scenario number one. Scenario number one is you're always going up, because if you're always going up, I'm going to probably the clustered index of the higher up table. I don't want to call it parent and child table because it may not necessarily be hierarchically related that way. But think of it as if I'm always driving off of the table that has the foreign key constraint on it, well, I'm not going to benefit from an index. And the other case is I can build a better index. So this would be I have multiple columns. I may need an include column. So in those scenarios, we don't necessarily want to have that, because what's going to happen is you end up with the DTS answer of, well, then we'll have an index on customer ID. We'll have an index on order date. We'll have an index on customer ID, comma, order date. We'll have one on order date, comma, customer ID. And we'll have a second one on customer ID because, whatever. Not great. That would not be a great answer either. So there are good reasons why this is not the answer, but I think Greg down here does say, hey, what if you make a default? You make it as a default of you create an index, or excuse me, you create a foreign key constraint. It references sales.customers on customer ID. You automatically create an index. Or you could tell it, no, I don't want this indexed. And say non-indexed. Do not make this indexed. And then life would be better. I think it's kind of neat. It would increase the amount of blocking that would happen on foreign key creation. Now, granted, if you're creating a table, obviously you're not going to have any blocking because the table is new. Nobody's going to be able to access that table. But if you're thinking about altering an existing table and adding a foreign key constraint, there is one scan of the data. But then for the index creation, you might be able to get away with that. You might be able to get away with creating the index at the same time as scanning the table to ensure the foreign key is valid. So it technically might not. Um, Hypothetically, if the database engine ran both of those tasks concurrently and just kind of took advantage of the fact that, hey, we're doing a scan of the orders table, we're doing a scan of the customers table because we need to do that for the foreign key constraint, assuming that is not a constraint with no check or is not trusted. So in that scenario, because we're already scanning once, if we can just take the results of that and lob it all into an index, that wouldn't necessarily increase the amount of time that you would have to wait for foreign key creation to complete. Obviously, reviewing a workload would be great for an AI to determine if you should. I'm just going to stare at my clock for a few more seconds, just make it really awkward. I don't necessarily disagree in principle. I will probably disagree in practice, depending on the model that you're using and the process that you're defining. Um, I don't have a lot of faith in existing models and processes to do a good job of things. All right, so that was Greg Lowe article. Now, our next article is from a fellow by the name of Greg Lowe. You may not know who this fellow is. It's literally the same guy. I found this one, however, does not come from Brent's newsletter. This one came from my looking at Greg's blog, especially, again, now that Greg has an RSS feed. Okay, so before I get to this other one, which I think is a really neat article, Anders Model 4C. Maybe. I think Anders Model 4C hallucinates far too often. Keeps talking about stuff. Speaking of hallucinations, actually, this is very apropos. It fits in with this article. No. I just pasted the same article again. That's actually reasonably funny. Our next article comes from a fellow by the name of Greg Lowe. And this one is actually very different from the post that I keep pasting in. This is a picture of a man falling out of a DC-8, Delta Charlie 8. And the concept of this post, the question is, are we beyond being able to believe the truth? I think this is a really neat article to talk about. So we're just going to focus a little bit for the guy who fell out of the landing gear. He was like in the wheel well when the landing gear dropped or was in the process of dropping. So did he. And this is a fellow by the name of Keith Sapsford. He fell to his death from within the landing gear area of a DC-8 that was leaving Sydney bound for Tokyo. This was inadvertently captured by an amateur photographer named John Gilpin. And so Greg says, what fascinated me is when I read all the comments, the vast majority of the comments were saying the photo was fake, this was AI generated, this could not possibly have happened. It literally happened. So Greg's like, I'm old enough to remember when this happened in 1970. It's quite famous in Australia, and this photograph was part of a double page spread in Life magazine that year. People do hide in there once in a while. They're usually frozen to death by the time the wheels come back out. Yeah, that does happen. I even remember when the U.S. was pulling out of Afghanistan, there was a famous picture of people falling out of wheel wells of the airplanes there. So that's something that happened not even a decade ago. This was just a few years ago. So this does happen. It's not nearly as common as it used to be. I mean, that's one of the benefits of much stronger security around airports, like not letting people just wander around on the tarmac. But it has happened. It does happen. And it usually does not turn out very well. So Keith is far from the only person to be a wheel well stowaway. Actually, interesting. There is in fact a Wikipedia article on wheel well stowaways. Happened less than 3 weeks ago. Wow. 113 instances between 1947 and June of 2015. 113 people were all male, predominantly under 30. that tracks. Totally believe that. Um, Scrolling down through here, so this only gets you to 2019. Actually, no, it does not get you just to 2019. I noticed that. Let me refresh this because I noticed one in September of this year. So as I scroll down just a little bit, this article here, September 28th, Frankfurt to Madrid, or Frankfurt or Madrid to Charlotte. So this was body found in maintenance in Charlotte. Is this the one that you're talking about, Anders? Because that looks like it was just about a month ago, and would have been right in the same area. So um, not even 2 months ago, somebody who flew from Kabul to Delhi,
Ooh, that's painful.
yeah, survived an A340
And they
flight.
sent them right back. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you didn't buy a ticket, you can't come back here, can't come here. So okay, that was the one you were talking about. Okay, yeah, so this is something that still happens. We see three instances of it this year. Um, One person did it in the U.S. An A321 JFK to Fort Lauderdale, discovered in the landing gear compartment.
That tracks.
I bet on the 340 he was in the central wheel well. I mean, that's possible. I don't know any of the details here. There are links where we could look into it, but fairly interesting, noting that yes, this is still an occurrence that does happen. But that's not necessarily the point of Greg's article. Greg's article is more of in a world where it is so easy to generate fake images, how do you believe something? How can you find something trustworthy? Does an image have any meaning anymore? I would say it is tough, but I would also point out we've had airbrushing for decades. There's the famous picture of Joseph Stalin and Stalin with the guy, Stalin without the guy. There have been plenty of cases of old image, new image, and just slap it in. If I didn't take it, I question it. I mean, that is fair. There's also the fact that it is pretty easy to generate an image in a way that is not necessarily indicative of what really happened. There are techniques that can allow us to trick the eye, that can allow us to make something look like something it's not. And that's before you get into Photoshop. I mean, we've had Photoshop as a tool for decades. I mentioned airbrushing beforehand. You have more physical mechanisms for photo modification. The fact that something is photographed doesn't make it true, never has made it true. And this is why, if you have a legal situation, you would always have, whenever evidence gets presented in a legal situation, there is always an expert, a person who validates the image, who validates that, to the best of my knowledge, this is an image that is representative of the event that did occur. And the reason that we have to do that is it's very simple to modify something after the fact and show, oh, well, here is my client in the Bahamas at the time. How do you know when the photo was taken? Well, there's a marker down in the bottom left. How do you know that marker is actually accurate? Was the camera synchronized? Do we have the camera that this was taken on? Do we have enough information to be able to validate that the information that is displayed to us is accurate? And these are the sorts of things that you would have to go through in a legal scenario. And ultimately, it is a human who is verifying that, to the best of my knowledge, this is in fact what the lawyer is bringing it up to be. So we don't have the evidence itself. You always have to have a person's interpretation of the evidence because of the fact that you can fake evidence. In a world where everybody's phone creates fake images, thinking about the evidentiary aspects of that is really interesting. They didn't need AI to fake evidence of the moon landing. Exactly, Solomon. Actually, that reminds me, there was a there was a TV show. I loved this TV show. It was called Dark Skies, and one of the premises of the show, it was supposed to go. Each season was a decade. So the first season was going to be. It starts with John Kennedy's assassination. He's assassinated by somebody because he's going to tell people about the aliens that have been secretly invading the Earth since Roswell, when they came down and gave an ultimatum, and American artillery blew that ship up. They had AI back then. Yeah, exactly. But basically, the point I was getting at was in the show. I saw an online version of the show book that they were going to use for the decades, and it was things like U.S. fakes the moon landing because they know that the aliens were on the moon, that the moon was their staging base, and they wanted to scare them. The USSR and US secretly were allied together to fight the aliens, but they had to look like they were at odds with each other because they both needed to build up massive military campaigns against these aliens, um, and all of this other stuff. So that's just what that reminded me of, Solomon. It was an interesting show. The biggest problem was it was so hard to tell, like, are these good people or bad people? And were these the good guys or the bad guys? And wait, are the good guys actually good guys, or are they bad guys because they kind of were bad guys for 2 episodes and now they're kind of good guys again? And I don't understand what's going on. And it turns out that when you have 1 episode a week of that, it's real hard to follow. So, nonetheless, moral of the story here is think about a world where your phone can just make people disappear. Oh, it just took out the bystanders. They market that as a feature on your phone. That is an artificial manipulation of the image. Could that picture be used as evidence? If like you have an image of somebody getting stabbed, can you prove that that was the original? Like, do you have the original image pre touch up? And for a lot of new phones, the answer is no. All that they start with the touch up version. Older phones start with the original photo and then do edits or touch ups after that. But if you have only the touch up, you have only the modified version, now you have a good question of evidence around how valuable is that photo if you already have to admit that it is not the original. It is not what actually was taken by the device. How much manipulation can happen before the image is no longer credible? And it is a good question. I don't have any good answers. I think the legal system is going to have to muddle along a little bit because you can show, oh, this video shows this thing. What if I have the raw file there as well? If you have the raw file, if that was the original version, then yeah, that would work. So like if you have a Canon or a Nikon device and you're shooting even in JPEG is you can arguably get away with that, but you have to show the amount of pre-processing. You kind of have to show what the camera is doing, and as the camera does more, then it gets tougher. So like if the camera literally is removing people from the image because all those people are in the background, or if it's changing the colors, if it's changing tones, if it's changing significant parts of the image, it might bring into question what else it has changed on that image. My DSLR saves both JPEG and RAW. Yeah, my understanding. Again, I should note I am not a lawyer. I'm not an expert witness. I am a person who has read a little bit on the topic and is probably bloviating at this point. I am definitely on that ledge of knowing what I'm talking about and peering right over that precipice. I think if you had just the JPEG, it would still be okay. If you have the RAW, that is generally preferable because that is before image coloration, image processing that's happening. But it is preferable. I know it is preferable to have as original of an image as possible. And so for a DSLR, that's usually not a big deal. But if you think about yeah, I'm focusing specifically on the Google and Apple camera commercials where they're substantially modifying the image, because that is probably a sharp line, or there is a sharp line somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where that sharp line should be, but there has to be a sharp line somewhere that says this image is no longer credible because there's some certain amount of manipulation that is beyond what we can reasonably expect. And I don't know where that is. So it kind of ties off of Greg's post here of, at some point, how do you verify that a thing happened, that this picture does in fact reflect a real event, that it was a real image and it was not a fake image that somebody created recently, or that a real image that somebody substantially modified? And when you're we're at the beginnings of an era where you can generate artificial video. Um, that can and will cause challenges over the next couple of decades, as you figure that video quality will probably get better. Um, Image quality has already gotten pretty decent. There are still tells that, oh, this is an artificially generated image, but when the first step is expect doubt, and you see a real image like this, you say, oh, well, that couldn't have happened, and therefore it has to be fake. That's going to be a challenge for people. Speaking of challenges for people, we have one more link, one more thing I want to talk about. And that is Lewis Davidson is back in the blogging, or he is back in the blogging business, but he's also back in the podcasting business. So he is starting a new podcast. I'm not going to play any of it because you can go check out his video, but he calls it Tilting with Tuples. And most importantly, the primary reason that I am linking to this, that I am promoting Lewis's new podcast, is that he pronounces tuple correctly. He uses the actual the mathematical term, which is pronounced as tuple. So I appreciate that. I appreciate it enough that I'm willing to give him a shout out and say, hey, you should probably click on this play button on your own browser in your own circumstances and check it out. He has 10 episodes recorded, so you should expect at least 10 episodes of this. We'll see how it shakes out, but I do again appreciate, is there a different way to pronounce it? A lot of people will pronounce it as tuple, which is not correct. So that it is properly speaking a tuple. Tuples are very sargeable, I will say that. And I think it's gonna do it. That is just about gonna do it. We are near the top of the hour. I will note that we do have one meeting this month, and that is going to be our second Tuesday. Rob Farley is going to talk to us from Australia, and that'll be on November 11th, Tuesday the 11th for us. It'll be his Wednesday the 12th. So check that out. We will not have a main meeting because that's the week of Past Summit and Microsoft Ignite. So I kind of expect that's the week when SQL Server 2025 comes out. We will not have an advanced DBA meeting, or excuse me, we'll not have a data science meeting because that's the fourth Tuesday, and it's going to be right before Thanksgiving. We will have Shop Talk in 2 weeks, which is going to be right before Ignite and Past Summit. So we probably won't be able to gloat about SQL Server 2025 coming out, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
We'll put out our own big announcements.
Yeah, exactly. We will have our own announcements that will rival Ignite and Past Summit. They will rue the day that they messed with us.
Yeah, we got a new version of Polybase out.
We've got a new. We're gonna come up with some awesome things. We're gonna do some stuff, and they'll all be jealous, and they'll say, "Man, I wish I could have gone to Shop Talk Con 2025." But we're selling tickets to Shop Talk Con 2026. Just like $95,000 a person. Basically, it's the new Fire Festival. It's going to be that good. But we are we're out of time for tonight. So thank you again for stopping by, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Remember, next Tuesday, not tomorrow, but a Tuesday after, we will have Rob Farley. Maybe I'll hijack the auditorium at Summit. That's the spirit, Anders. You should definitely do that and probably not get arrested. But we'll see each other. Until we do, everybody, take care.